Viridian, the Green Guide by My Head in the Clouds, Not Coming Down, a Boku no Hero Academia fanfic. Chapter 18 New Beginnings. Izuku had spent the last week cramming non-stop for his entrance exam. He still wasn't entirely confident in his ability to pass, but he reached the point in his studying where he was starting to forget more than he learned, which probably meant that he should just take the exam. Even if he'd inevitably fail, at least then he'd be able to move on and put his eggs in another basket. Mom was at work and had left the morning after giving him a kiss on the cheek and wishing him luck on the test. She had promised him katsudon that evening as well, either as a congratulatory meal or as comfort food. It would depend on how Izuku thought he did. Izuku didn't really see the point of her going through all the trouble for him, but there was a selfish part of him that was just so happy that she cared. He wished that part didn't feel so good. It made the rest of him feel worse. Just before noon, Izuku finally put his books to the side and went to the school's website, clicking on the tab that would take him to the entrance exam. He spent about a half hour filling out his basic information, like his name, what other schools he's gone to, his GPA for the last year, etc., cursing the fact that his cast made it so hard to type. He could still move his fingers, but his entire arm itched and started to ache if he used it too much. So, at least for the next few days, he'd be stuck chicken pecking at the keyboard. It was so annoying. Finally, he reached the window screen and read through the instructions. The test itself was 200 questions, and he had 3 hours to complete it. Izuku glanced at the clock. It was noon, which meant that he had until 3 to finish the exam. That would mean he'd have just under a minute to answer each question, but that didn't count the time that he'd have to use to check over his answers at the end. Izuku took one last shaky breath before clicking the button that said, Start Exam. The questions were deceptively easy. Izuku had assumed that he would have to rush to complete each question in under a minute, but he was able to answer most questions almost instantly, which gave him more time on the more difficult questions, like the ones in the math section. If Izuku wasn't freaking out about the fact that his entire future depended on him doing well on this test, he'd almost say it was fun. Was that weird? He could almost hear Kacchan telling him that he was a damn nerd. Before he knew it, Izuku had answered every single question. He sighed in relief and looked at the clock. It was now 1:25, which meant he still had... Wait a minute. Izuku felt a cold wave of anxiety wash over him. How long did he have again? Izuku knew it had a 3 in it. But did that mean he had 3 hours? Or was it 1 hour, 30 minutes? How long was he supposed to spend? He couldn't have finished in under half the time. It must have just been an hour and a half. Which means he only had... He looked over at the clock again and started to freak out. It was 1:28. He only had 2 minutes. He didn't have any time to look over his answers. But if he didn't look over his answers, he wouldn't have a chance to change any of his answers, which meant he had no chance of passing. Unless he really did have a full 3 hours. But if he didn't have a full 3 hours and he tried to go back and check his answers, then he'd miss the deadline and fail by default. But if he didn't check his answers, then he wouldn't pass. How long did he have? Was it 3 hours or an hour and a half? Izuku glanced at the clock one last time. 1:29. It was better safe than sorry, right? Wouldn't it be better to get half the questions wrong than to turn it in late? Izuku flailed as he scrambled to press submit, then frantically froze as he realized what he'd just done. What had he just done? This was terrible. He didn't even check any of his answers. His eyes stung as he tried to hold back his tears. Looked like Mom's katsudon was going to be a comfort meal after all. Shoto curled up in the corner of the staff room at lunch and scrolled through the obituaries. He vaguely knew he was just making things worse for himself, but he couldn't help checking every day, a sick sense of dread deep in his stomach as he desperately hoped that he wouldn't recognize any of the photos. Not that he'd ever seen Viridian without the mask, but he knew the kid was young and had green hair, plus the fact that suicide would be listed as the cause of death would be a dead giveaway. When the kid hadn't shown his face for a few days, Shoto had hoped he'd finally taken some time off to heal from some of his injuries. He'd thought that maybe the kid had actually grown a small sense of self-preservation. But that only went so far. It now had been over a week since Shoto had seen Viridian. He'd even checked with Amplifier and Rocklock, but neither of them had seen him. And Tsukachi said that no one matching Viridian's description had been found dead from a villain fight. Even some of the other nocturnal heroes were starting to ask about the missing problem child. And they didn't even run into Viridian that often in the first place. Shoto really hoped that Viridian's sudden disappearance didn't mean anything. That maybe the kid's parents had somehow found out about his nightly activities, and that they had forced him to stop, or maybe that he'd just gotten bored. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. The problem child had thrown himself headfirst into vigilantism to the point where he had become entrenched in the city's hero scene in only a few months, and the kid seemed to enjoy it. So Shoto couldn't imagine that he'd ever given up on that. Not unless... He shook his head and put away his phone. It wouldn't do any good to worry himself into exhaustion. The most he could do was keep an eye on the obituaries and hope to every deity that he knew that Viridian hadn't decided that suicide by villain was taking too long. Maybe he was just reading too far into things, and Viridian's mental health wasn't nearly as bad as it seemed, and he was just out of town. But if he was just out of town, why hadn't he given any warning before disappearing? Shoto groaned and stretched as he emerged from his cocoon to get ready for his next class. Thankfully, his current class had responded well to his logical ruse, and he hadn't had to permanently expel that many of them. So he had quite a few students who were actually showing promise now that they were taking things seriously. He just needed to remind himself that he had more than enough brats to worry about, without fretting about the problem child. Didn't make things any easier, but it was the most logical course of action. "Hey, Shoto!" Mike yelled, making him flinch and wish he'd actually gotten a nap. "You look like a mess. Is something on your mind?" "Doesn't he always look like a mess?" Snipe asked. "What's the difference?" Shoto glared at him when Midnight struggled to hold back laughter. "I can't explain it," Mike insisted, "but Shoto has a normal dishevelment and his anxious dishevelment. And today, he looks like he's worried about something. Is one of your students giving you trouble?" "Not one of my official ones," Shoto muttered, but it didn't seem like anyone heard him. "Oh, are you going to expel someone else?" Ectoplasm asked. "Dang, I'm gonna lose the bet." Shoto glared at them. "You shouldn't be betting about how likely I am to expel my students." "We're not betting on if you'll expel your students," Mike yelled. "No, we're betting on when you'll expel your students," Midnight added helpfully. Shoto groaned. "If you must know, I'm worried about something on my patrol. There's just a vigilante that's been hanging around, and I haven't seen him for a while. I'm just hoping nothing's happened to him, that's all." Midnight grinned. "Aww, I knew you had a heart. What are you gonna do?" "There's not much I can do. Damn problem child." "Well," Mike said, "when he shows his face again, ground him. That'll teach him to mess with you." Shoto rolled his eyes and ignored the sick sense of worry in his stomach that just wouldn't go away. He wished he'd noticed Viridian's depression sooner. Maybe if he caught it before the kid had disappeared, he could have convinced the kid to get some therapy. Even if Viridian refused to go, Shoto still could have found some way to help so that the kid didn't feel like he had to. Well, he just hoped that he wasn't too late. But one thing's for sure, if by some miracle Viridian was still alive, Shoto wouldn't make the same mistake twice. After changing out of his school clothes, Katsuki walked to the address he found on the internet. The building was plain, just a community center with a shitty playground off to one side, and a couple of rooms for art classes and support groups. But he ignored them for right now and walked to the front desk. The lady behind it smiled at him as he waited for him to find the words. Stupid. Why was this so hard? I was wondering. Katsuki cringed. He was practically stuttering, almost like Doku. I was wondering if there was a hero named Amplifier here. I read on your website that... The receptionist nodded. Sure thing. Amplifier. She called back to the offices behind her. You've got a visitor. Awesome. Amplifier was a lot bouncier than Katsuki had been expecting. considering the program that the website said she ran. He had been expecting her to look a lot more intimidating. "What can I do for you, kid?" Katsuki's mouth went dry, and the only thing that kept him from running out the door was the fact that he wasn't some shitty coward. "You're the fucker that runs the rehabilitation group for villains on probation, right?" Amplifier blinked a few times before she grinned. "That's me. We meet once a week and focus on rehabilitation and personal development. It's been really effective, and we have a meeting starting in just a few minutes. But then you'd probably already know that, considering that you're here. Do you have a note from your probation officer?" "I'm not a fucking..." Katsuki forced himself to calm down. "I'm not on probation. Your website said that you could use a couple extra hands, so..." He took a deep breath. "I want to volunteer.